The focus of this video is on the Smart Resource blocks. Now, Smart Resources are essentially queues with some amount of intelligence built into them. And there are two categories of these Smart Resources. The first on the left are the untimed Smart Resources. And the release of the head of the queue is triggered by an input on the POP input port at the lower or the bottom of the Smart Resource. The category of Smart Resource on the right is timed, which means that the release of the head of the queue is based upon an internal timer expiring for the head of the queue. Consider the following block diagram. On the left, we have transaction generators, which are going to be in this model models of three separate hosts sending requests to the DRAM. And each of those requests are going to be processed by the processing block, and then all of them sent into an arbitration, whose function is to arbitrate between the three different hosts according to whatever arbitration mechanism has been set up. And from the arbiter, the transaction will go into the command queue, which will use or is using the Smart Resource Model untimed version. When the transaction enters the command queue, it will go into its appropriate place in the queue. And when the transaction is finished in the DRAM, it will then initiate two actions. The first action it will initiate is a pop operation on the head of the queue so that the next transaction will be forwarded to the DRAM. And the other action is that the transaction that departs from the DRAM will go to a smart timed resource and will go into that queue. And once the transaction reaches the head of the queue due to departures of transactions that were in the queue ahead of it, the amount of time it will remain in this block will be dependent on the block parameter called time field, which we have linked into the system parameter execute queue service time. So what happens is this: the transaction will arrive on the input to the smart timed resource, and it will enter the queue. Once the transactions ahead of the queue have departed from the smart time resource, then it will be placed in the front of the queue, and it will wait a certain amount of time, the exit queue service time in this case, and then it itself will automatically depart from the smart resource and head, in this case, to a plotter which is measuring the latency of the transaction in the system. And so we have demonstrated here the two different categories, the untimed smart resource and the timed smart resource. This concludes our video on the Smart Resource blocks.